The slave trade in Africa began long before the arrival of Europeans. For centuries, African societies practiced forms of slavery within their own communities. Slaves were often prisoners of war, debtors, or criminals. They worked as domestic servants, laborers, or soldiers. However, the transatlantic slave trade, which started in the 15th century, was different. It was unprecedented in its scale and brutality. The arrival of Portuguese traders on the West African coast marked a turning point. Europeans were establishing colonies in the Americas and needed a large labor force to work on sugarcane plantations and in mines. They turned their eyes to Africa, where they found willing trading partners in some African kingdoms and merchants. In exchange for guns, textiles, and other goods, African traders sold enslaved Africans to Europeans. This marked the beginning of a dark chapter in human history. One of the most notorious examples of this trade was the Kingdom of Congo. Initially, the King of Congo engaged in trade with the Portuguese, hoping to establish diplomatic and economic ties. However, the insatiable demand for slaves led the Portuguese to exploit the relationship. They fueled internal conflicts and encouraged slave raids, eventually destabilizing the entire kingdom. This pattern, unfortunately, repeated itself across many coastal African societies. It's crucial to understand that the transatlantic slave trade was not a one-sided affair. While European demand drove the trade, it was facilitated by collaboration with certain African leaders and merchants. This collaboration, often driven by short-term economic gain, had devastating long-term consequences for the continent. The transatlantic slave trade was a complex network involving several key players. European powers, primarily the Portuguese, British, French, Spanish, and Dutch, dominated the trade. Each nation carved out its own piece of the African coastline, establishing forts and trading posts. These outposts became hubs for the trade, serving as holding pens for captured Africans before their perilous journey across the Atlantic. While European powers orchestrated the trade, African middlemen played a crucial role in supplying the human cargo. They organized slave raids into the African interior, often targeting villages far from the coast. These raids, characterized by their brutality, tore apart families and communities. The captives, often marched for weeks, chained together in coffles, endured unimaginable suffering before even reaching the coast. The conditions in the coastal slave forts were nothing short of horrific. Crammed into dungeons, often with little food, water, or ventilation, many died from disease and malnutrition even before boarding the slave ships. The transatlantic voyage, known as the Middle Passage, was a nightmare. Shackled together in the overcrowded and unsanitary holds of ships, Africans endured appalling conditions. The scale of the trade is staggering. Over a period of over 400 years, millions of Africans were forcibly transported to the Americas. It's estimated that for every enslaved African who survived the journey, 1 or 2 died. The human cost of this trade is immeasurable. The capture and transport of enslaved Africans were characterized by brutality and dehumanization. African traders and their European counterparts employed various methods to procure their human cargo. Raiding parties, armed with guns obtained through trade with Europeans, attacked villages, often at night, to maximize surprise and minimize resistance. The captives, often bound with ropes or chains, were then forced to march long distances to the coast. These journeys, known as coffles, were grueling tests of endurance. The scorching sun, lack of food and water, and constant threat of violence made these marches death marches for many. Those who faltered or attempted to escape were often met with brutal punishment or even death. Upon reaching the coast, the captives were held in fortified trading posts, often for weeks or even months, awaiting transport across the Atlantic. Conditions in these forts were deplorable. Cramped into dark, poorly ventilated dungeons, the captives endured unimaginable suffering. Disease was rampant and mortality rates were high. The journey across the Atlantic, known as the Middle Passage, was the most horrific aspect of the transatlantic slave trade. Enslaved Africans were packed tightly into the holds of ships, often lying shoulder to shoulder, with barely enough room to move. The conditions were so horrific that many died from disease, malnutrition, or despair during the 6 to 8 week journey. The transatlantic slave trade had a devastating impact on Africa, leaving lasting scars on the continent's social, economic, and political landscape. Demographically, the trade led to a significant decline in Africa's population. The constant loss of millions of people, primarily young and able-bodied, weakened communities and hampered economic development. Economically, the slave trade distorted African economies. It shifted the focus from traditional industries like agriculture and crafts towards the capture and trade of human beings. This created a dependence on the European demand for slaves and hindered the development of diverse and sustainable economies. The trade also fueled conflicts and instability as African societies competed for control of the slave trade routes and access to European goods. The social impact of the trade was equally devastating. Families and communities were torn apart as loved ones were captured and sold into slavery. The constant threat of raids and abductions created a climate of fear and mistrust. The psychological trauma inflicted on generations of Africans is immeasurable. The trade also undermined traditional social structures and values as kinship ties and communal bonds were shattered. The transatlantic slave trade stands as one of the darkest chapters in human history. It was a horrific system of exploitation and brutality that inflicted immense suffering on millions of Africans and left an indelible mark on the continent. Remembering this dark chapter is crucial, not only to acknowledge the suffering of the past, but also to inform our understanding of the present and to work towards a future free from all forms of exploitation and injustice.